Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are cracking open a really fascinating historical file, but we're going to read it through a completely new lens. We're looking at a famous event from 7th century Mecca, the rebuilding of the sacred Kaaba. But here's the twist. We're actually going to analyze this as a highly actionable, modern case study in crisis management and executive leadership. Because honestly, whether you're managing a small team of 5 or directing a massive corporate merger, the underlying dynamics of human ego, resource allocation, and conflict resolution, they are exactly the same today as they were centuries ago.
Okay, let's dive right into this framework. We're going to break this down into 5 key parts. First, the unforeseen operational crisis. Then, setting strict ethical baselines. Third, severe stakeholder gridlock. Fourth, the inclusive leadership solution. And finally, the executive takeaways.
So, starting with Phase 1, the unforeseen operational crisis.
You know that sinking feeling when a sudden, totally unpredictable disaster just upends all your quarterly goals? Well, for the leaders of the Quraysh tribe, about 5 years before the beginning of prophethood, this disaster literally came falling from the sky. A massive flood just absolutely hammered Mecca. The floodwaters rushed through the city and severely weakened the walls of the Kaaba. Large cracks appeared and the whole structure was deemed completely unsafe. The leaders were terrified this incredibly sacred site might actually collapse. So suddenly, they're staring down this monumental infrastructure project they had to completely rebuild. But initially, total operational paralysis. Nobody wanted to dismantle the sacred site. I mean, it was the ultimate legacy system, and everyone was terrified to touch it. It actually took one respected leader stepping up and safely removing the very first stones just to break that paralysis and get the rest of the workforce on board.
Moving into Phase 2, setting strict ethical baselines.
Before the heavy lifting really got underway, the leadership committee made a fascinating strategic decision. It's basically the 7th century equivalent of strict modern ESG or compliance standards. The Quraysh leaders laid down a hard rule. This rebuild would be funded exclusively with lawful, honest wealth. The House of Allah had to be built with what they called pure earnings, and these constraints were absolute non-negotiables. No stolen money, no money earned through interest, and absolutely no money derived from oppression. Even while staring down a terrifying emergency, they just flat out refused to compromise their core institutional ethics.
But, as we all know, strict compliance usually comes with some heavy operational costs. Because they refused to use any unlawful money, they suddenly faced a massive budget shortfall. They literally just didn't have enough pure wealth to rebuild the Kaaba on its original, much larger foundations. So, what did they do? They made a really tough executive call and reduced the project scope. They left a small area beside the Kaaba outside the newly built walls, an area known today as the Hijr. This is just a perfect illustration of committing to your ethics over the project scope. They willingly chose a smaller footprint rather than tainting the entire project with unethical funding.
Which brings us to Phase 3, severe stakeholder gridlock. So, with the budget set, the construction begins, and it is going great. For weeks, the execution phase is absolutely flawless. Everyone, including a young, roughly 35-year-old Muhammad, is working side by side, collaboratively hauling heavy stones down from the mountains. But the moment they hit the final milestone, placing the sacred black stone, all that beautiful collaboration just vanishes into thin air. The hard work was done, and now it was time for the glory. Suddenly, every single tribe is demanding the exclusive privilege of placing the stone. This wasn't some mild disagreement around a conference table. This was a fierce, interdepartmental clash of egos. The tension spiked so high that some tribes were literally preparing for a physical battle. Absolute, total gridlock.
I want you to really put yourself in the shoes of a project manager for a second. You have all these different departments, these proud tribal leaders ready to literally go to war over who gets the ultimate credit for the project's crowning achievement. For days, the entire operation is just completely stalled out, and actual bloodshed is threatening the most sacred place on earth. How in the world do you navigate out of something like that?
Well, after days of this incredibly dangerous standoff, a respected elder steps in to prevent a total organizational collapse. He proposes a high-stakes idea. The next person to enter the sacred mosque will decide this matter. This is a brilliant strategic pivot. He's actively shifting the decision-making power away from the deadlocked internal stakeholders and delegating it to neutral, external arbitration. He forces everyone to buy into a process before they even know who the arbitrator is going to be.
And that perfectly sets up Phase 4, the inclusive leadership solution.
The person who happens to walk through that entrance is about to deliver an absolute masterclass in change management. It is Muhammad, again, well before his prophethood. And the moment the tribe see him, they immediately shout, Al-Amin, the Trustworthy. We accept his judgment. Now, this is a massive leadership lesson right here. Muhammad was accepted as the ultimate judge not because he carried some formal, intimidating job title, but entirely because of his profound personal brand equity. He had spent his entire life building an unshakable reputation for absolute honesty and wisdom. True leadership authority, it stems directly from the trust of your peers. Because he had stockpiled that trust capital, the stakeholders instantly de-escalated.
And this brilliantly illustrates his totally out-of-the-box solution to the crisis. Muhammad didn't just pick a winner and a loser, which, let's be honest, would have instantly restarted the war. Instead, he asked for a large cloth. He placed the black stone right in the center. Then, he invited one leader from each of the conflicting tribes to grab an edge of the cloth. Together, as a team, they lifted the stone up to the wall. And finally, Muhammad himself carefully pushed the stone into its exact final place.
The pure genius of this becomes super obvious when you look at conflict resolution models. The traditional approach they were heading toward was a classic zero-sum game. If Tribe A wins, Tribe B automatically loses, which leads straight back to tribal warfare. But Muhammad's approach? It's pure collaborative synergy. By using that shared cloth, he distributed the glory evenly among all the stakeholders, validating everyone's hard work and contribution. But, and this is key, he still maintained final executive control by physically placing the stone into the wall himself. The conflict ended instantly, and peace was completely restored.
Finally, Phase 5, Executive Takeaways.
So the crucial point here is really distilling what we can learn from this incredible historical incident. Let's look at 3 timeless principles from this 7th century event that tie directly into modern management. First, wisdom overcomes anger. When egos flare up and departments start fighting for the credit, a wise, collaborative solution, like that shared cloth, can instantly diffuse the tension. Second, honesty earns respect. You simply cannot mediate a crisis if you don't already have the trust of your team. Muhammad's reputation as Al-Amin was the literal key to his authority. And third, pure wealth brings blessing. The Quraysh's strict adherence to ethical funding, even when it caused a huge budget shortfall and forced a smaller footprint, proves that maintaining your institutional integrity has to remain paramount.
Which leaves us with one incredibly vital question about your own leadership capital. Muhammad was able to step in and solve a crisis that was inches away from bloodshed purely because he had spent decades being reliable, honest, and completely trustworthy. So, are you building enough trust with your team today to mediate the unforeseen crises of tomorrow? It's a pretty powerful question to reflect on, isn't it? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. If you found these leadership insights valuable, please share this analysis with your colleagues, and as always, keep leading with wisdom.